So it's now recording. And then what we will do is when Valor joins us, then we'll be able to just catch them up. And then perhaps if not, then they can access this at a later time. Right. But Andy, did you want to just start us off, having initiated the
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the initial conversation and I think the initial frustrations that we were having and kind of discussing as a group was kind of around the idea that a lot of the seminars that we have been going through,
right.
I think because of the limited time that we've had, have really felt like they were geared towards people at the binary extremes,
right?
People that tended to be cis straight,
right?
Pretty, like identifying as female or male, and just feeling like we kind of started this conversation of like there's more to it than that, but
right.
I felt like we never kind of got to that. And then I think for us, like I think some of the issues became for those who do not find themselves at either extremes, like how do we kind of address that conversation in a way that like personally for me, like I don't know how to speak into that, and then and also just like how do you continue that conversation in a faith-based manner, whether it's like theological or spiritual or just however. So it really just became, we wanted to reach out, and because we know that like this is a conversation that you really inspired for us, and we just hope that you could kind of maybe help us along this conversation, if that makes sense. And Anna and Albert, if you guys had anything to add.
Right.
Yeah, I think we just want to learn. I mean, I think it's perhaps appropriate that maybe Valor isn't here. I think she's most able to speak on this more than perhaps any of us here who are more at the extremes, as like what Andy said, but we're wanting to learn how to be able to not only speak from this other place, but also just try to understand.
Okay, right. Thank you. And Anna?
Yeah, I think Andy summarized it really well, and I also echo Albert's sentiments. I also identify as cisgender and straight, and I think through PAAC fellowship and being in PAAC, and then also being in a small group with Valor, who doesn't identify inside the binary, has left me and pushed me to think outside of that a lot. And so, that's, I think, where we want to focus on for today.
Right.
How do we think about this? How can we learn about this?
Okay. No, this is really helpful for me. In fact, let me just offer this as an opportunity, because if this is something that perhaps would be more beneficial for Valor to be able to join us. Well, first, in terms of logistics, would we be willing to meet again? Or, we can start this off here and then maybe check in again when Valor is available. Because I'm as willing to do that. So just throwing that out there for now. But for the time being, one of the frustrations, or maybe that's too strong of a word, I think one of the regrets that I had with this format is that we start out with Zoom, in which case I have that 1-2 hour window opportunity to throw everything out, and then sort of like, okay, here's the lesson plan for the rest of the 4 weeks, and then never check in again. So it's in so many ways, it's it's opportune, but also opens up a lot of questions, and I'm actually okay with that. But the question that all of you were asking, in fact, this is something that I left our discussion with, was that what are some of the resources that we might have as Asian Americans, and I'm using that word in all of its complexities, to think outside this binary of gender. And so what I'll do is perhaps I'll share 2 slides, if you don't mind, and then we can begin with that.
Mhm.
We can begin with that as our conversation point. You all can see this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's what I had
Yeah.
shared the last time.
Mhm.
And the one thing that we left off, and I remember this clearly, that it was Valor that had suggested it, was maybe even rethinking this soji that is oftentimes used to explain gender and sexuality outside of the paradigm of cis gendered individuals. Like I also identify as cisgender, although a gay man. But at the end of the day, my relationship with my body remains pretty much normalized. Oops, let me just do this again. Something. Can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm just gonna try to present this. I think we should be okay.
Mhm.
It's slow. There we go. And so the one thing that this particular paradigm was even distinguishing was not only just sexual attraction based on bodies, but even emotional attraction, right?
Mhm.
Which then makes it even more complicated, because even from our own experiences, while we might have certain people to whom we are physically attracted to, I think our own life experiences can bear itself out to show that sometimes people that we may not be physically attracted to invite us into this realm of attraction because of other qualities, whether it be their intellectual capacity, whether they have some certain charisma, whether they have certain gifts or just points of reference. I don't know if I had shared this in our seminar, but I had shared that in the Philippines, it was very typical in Catholic schools to actually have what do you call this, single sex education.
Yeah.
And amongst the girls' high schools, it was a common trope. Interestingly enough, girls' high schools, not boys' high schools, that the students would have girlfriends. And it's always age dependent. So a senior girl would have a girlfriend who's a frosh student. It's always an older and younger. And I don't know to what extent you're all familiar with the classical, what do you call this? The Greek paideia, this whole image of an older Greek military figure who takes under their wing a younger soldier who is oftentimes a few years outside of adolescence, and then they have this very intimate relationship with them that's both sexual as well as emotional. It was actually repeating that trope. And it was only typical in the girls' high schools, and often, because not always, once they graduated, then those relationships ended, and then these women that graduate end up entering heteronormative world. So all of these understandings that we have around what it means to be a gendered person is really much more complex than even this most basic understanding that we have about a binary. But the one thing that, and I'll just go through this and then open it up for discussion, that might be helpful to understand. At least this is how I approach it with my students, is that when we think of binary, ultimately, we are actually talking about language. And the language that we're using reflects the culture and the worldview from which we emerge. So a lot of our binary language is based out of the Judeo-Christian Neoplatonic worldview. And I think that's what I was attempting to explain in our seminar. This idea of the world as divided into pairs: the ideal, the forms, and the material, good and evil, male, female, masculine, feminine, powerful, powerless. And that paradigm, if we were to even marry that, so to speak, with the Jewish perspective of the world, or the Hebrew perspective of the world as God, creator, the created world, we're still working within that paradigm of binaries. And so that cosmic understanding of the world as somehow divided into these oppositional pairs then gets really translated almost intuitively, even in our language around gender. So, what does that do for us? Well, I think one of the clear effects of that is that when our language and our worldview is already binarized, if you will, then even our understanding of ourselves becomes, in a sense, stuck in a binary. I'm going to introduce this as sort of a perhaps a theoretical framing. I'm assuming, I don't want to assume, but I'm assuming we're all familiar with Freud, Sigmund Freud, and the ways in which Freudian psychology has pretty much shaped our understanding of the subject, who the self is, the person in contemporary society. We talk about the id as that most fundamental aspect of our drives, that pleasure principle. We talk about the superego as the manifestation of the law, social norms that impose order on the id. And we talk about the ego, that self in the middle, as somehow, what do you call this? The negotiating subject that holds our drives and holds the law in some healthy tension with the other. So a healthy self is that who navigates this divide between drives and rationality. But a lot of Freud's language is also very classical. So he talks about the figure of the father as somehow the metaphor for the law. So, and it's not unique to Freud. It's actually a very common trope in that particular world, where when we think about the ways in which subjectivity comes to mind, the idea of reason is oftentimes gendered. It's associated with a father figure, the law. And so that language, although helpful when we're trying to understand our sense of selves as holding this tension between reason and emotion, is now gendered even to the level of how we see ourselves. Are we more rational? Are we more logical? Are we more linear, which is implicitly paternal? Or are we more emotional, nurturing, lyrical, which is in so many ways implicitly maternal? Now, it's fascinating to think that, because this classical language in so many ways has permeated even the Judeo-Christian worldview. Not going to be so confusing, but I'm just going to take pause there, just hold that thought. But interestingly enough, in the Jewish worldview before Neoplatonism, when they think of the word wisdom, when they think of the word that's associated with a deeper understanding of the world that exceeds the limits of reason, say wisdom, those words are often also gendered, but in the opposite, more feminine. So they use words like the Greeks use the word Sophia. There's the word Chokmah. I mean, like, all of these words are oftentimes feminine. So it's fascinating how even outside of that Neoplatonic framework, there's still gender playing its or there's still the ways in which gender is manifest in the ways we understand how the world is perceived. So I'm sharing that not because not for any other reason except to show how sometimes our language and our perspective cultivate these binary systems that are at play.
Yeah.
Now, this system that I'm showing in front of you is actually a response to that binary Can you all see this more or less? I want to see if I could, what do you call this? Change the view here. Oh, I'm going to move this here. Okay, got it. There. Can you all see this more or less?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And in the way in which this system, so this system is actually based out of Julia Kristeva, who is still alive. You know, she is a Bulgarian/French philosopher who draws a lot from feminist theory to try to rethink, maybe even critique some of these Freudian understandings of the self that tends to be what do you call this, scaffolded on the classical language around the father. And so what she suggested is that the world as we know it today actually exists in this world of the symbolic. Now, this graph that I'm presenting to you is actually sort of a representation of the world that's symbolic after people are given birth to, and the world of the semiotic, which is the world that we all exist within the womb. You know, she uses the Greek word chora. And it was really insightful because she was suggesting that when I think of Michael, the idea that I'm Michael only makes sense once I enter the social world. And so once I'm given birth to and I'm outside, what do you call this, the womb, suddenly everything about me is now signified by gender. My body is now identified as male, and therefore I must be given a male name, and therefore my clothes must now evoke this. And then suddenly I enter this binary. The symbolic is the world of the binary. And, you know, you have other words. We have many words for it. Patriarchy is one word. Phallocentrism is another word. And she was suggesting that perhaps it might be worth, oops, what is this? It might be worth reconsidering that space before the symbolic, which is the metaphorical world of the womb, the chora. And that world is really more semiotic. And she uses the word semiotic in its classical sense, where it's really this collection of signs, disconnected signs, colors, sensations, if you will, emotions. So I'll give you an example of how semiotic might be different from the symbolic. Have you all ever, this is a stupid question, but just amuse me. You've all seen a stop sign, right? It's this,
yes.
My good. I hope you've seen a stop sign because you're obviously still alive and walking. So in a lot of ways, you know, you've been saved by many potential accidents on the street. So that stop sign is effective. It's the most effective symbol on the face of the planet, wherever we go. But there are several elements that's embedded in a stop sign. So you have letters, S-T-O-P, or if you're in another country, it would be different alphabets, if you will, different symbols. And then you have red. Red is almost universal. And of course, you have that, is that an octagon? 1, 2, 3,
Yes.
4, 5. Yes,
So,
it is. It's an octagonal shape. And then you have color white. But if you were to actually separate those elements, octagon, white, red, letters, they are simply just floating sensations. And that's what the semiotic is like. It's just these separate sensations that may not be connected to each other, but you're simply apprehending them as these elements that you're encountering, and they themselves are real. But we often overlook the importance of that initial encounter with the world because once we enter the social world, the symbolic, we are too quick to go into the mind to be able to somehow organize them into some logical thought. And so that's the same thing that happens to our bodies and gender, that once we enter the symbolic, suddenly, without even so much as considering the experiential and emotional aspects of our selfhood, we organize ourselves too quickly into this binary. And so as a result, you are now named Andy, you are now named Anna, you are named Albert. And so we find ourselves almost, I'm going to use this word really, really carefully, imposed upon. Our bodies are too quickly imposed upon within the binary. So the one thing she suggests is, how can we think of ourselves outside and perhaps beyond that binary. So she suggests, actually really rather elegantly, that within this heteronormative binary, maybe we can think of another way of looking at the self. So we use the word subject as a representation of this ideal human self that has agency. So for example, a child is not a subject because a child is still dependent. When we become adults, we have subjectivity because we are able to ascertain our fate. We can make decisions, and if things happen, we take full responsibility for it. But the subject is perhaps that self that succeeds in the symbolic. She actually makes an interesting claim that to the extent that the symbolic is fundamentally patriarchal, women's bodies will actually never fully enter into subjectivity. That somehow or the other, women's bodies will always be the exception to this system. That women's bodies are somehow beholden to the expectation of subjectivity. So male-bodied people have some agency to control and determine their fate. Women's bodies depend upon these subject male-bodied individuals. So this is her theory. She suggests that perhaps there's something in between the subject that we can call the abject. And, you know, in our common lexicon, the abject is oftentimes this person. An abject thing is something that is sort of, what do you call this? Outside the system. But I love these three examples that she uses. She is, rather than define an abject, she gives examples. One of which is death. The other one is, oh, good morning, Valor.
Good morning.
Let me
Sorry
just
I'm late.
Look at your background.
I know. How come you have that as a background?
We love it.
How'd you do that?
It's an option in Zoom to have a virtual background. So.
Okay. Note to self. That's a good thing. Rather than you all seeing my whatever this thing is behind me. So not quite as elegant as your background.
What a statement.
I know. Why don't we take pause here for a second and then just check in with Valor, because we just started, and so perhaps we can just ask how you're doing, how are things over in Honolulu, and then we can get back into our discussion.
Hi, sorry, we had quite a night last night, so yeah. I just overslept. Everybody was sick. It was just kind of so.
Oh.
Yeah.
I hope everybody's feeling okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So nothing with the pandemic. It was just everybody had stomach problems. So.
Oh, okay. On a personal question, I just realized you're in Oahu. Whereabouts in Oahu are you at, if you don't mind me asking?
I live in Kalihi.
Oh.
So like up in the valley.
Yeah, I used to teach at Damien Memorial.
Yep. That's close by, yeah.
Super awesome. Anyway, so we can talk more about that, but like, oh my Lord. Kalihi, that's awesome. Oh my Lord. I love Kalihi, especially the valley. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I grew up here. My dad was a child up here, so this is his childhood home, so
oh gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can believe that your view behind you is Kalihi. So okay, we'll let that go.
Oh.
Okay. Anyway, so I'll get back in and then we'll just open up for discussion. So just to catch you up, Valor, we were just talking about an alternative theory, and I'm using the word theory because it's probably a more general term that we can all sort of bite into, outside of the binary system. And one of the things, as I was mentioning earlier, is Julia Kristeva's theory around the semiotic, the idea that somehow when we are born, our bodies are already too quickly marked with signifiers that are gendered, that are perhaps identified also by class, by ethnicity, all of those other signifiers that essentially impose us into this binary system. And so what Kristeva was suggesting was rehabilitating this period before the symbolic, which she calls the Kora, the womb, So she's taking that both literally, because we did exist prior to birth, right? But at the same time, also metaphorically, that this space within the womb is that which escapes the almost, what do you call this? The weight, if you will, or even the imposition of the binary outside of the womb. And so rather than perhaps look at the world as simply this tension between who is the subject, which in a patriarchal system has to be male body, masculine, privileging strength, privileging public identities, versus the object, which is identified as a female body, feminine, privileging, or at least negating weakness, negating domesticity. Kristeva was suggesting the alternative of the abject figure. Now, this is where we sort of left off. I love these images because she talks about three elements that might give us insight as to what this alternative selfhood might look like. There are three things that we tend to have an ambivalent relationship with in our own embodied lives. One is death. The other one is this sense of repulsion, this part of ourselves that we tend to expel but are repelled by. And the third one is what she identifies as jouissance, or this sense of ecstasy. Now, they're theoretical language, but they're actually really simple. Death is very obvious. For some reason, we have been conditioned in our society to be ambivalent towards cadavers, corpses. So think of those experiences when perhaps we've attended a funeral with an open casket. To what extent have we taken account of our own relationship with that flesh, if you will, that's in front of us? The fact that we have to ask whether it's open or closed casket already says a lot, because in so many ways, the body, especially a dead body, is a reminder of something that we know is inherently part of our lives, but at the same time, something that somehow repels us. So that's an invitation for us to consider what is our relationship with death. The second one is this idea of repulsion. We were just talking about it earlier. In this time of the coronavirus, for example, suddenly all of us are averse to contact. Somehow all of us are averse to those moments in which our bodies can be penetrated by this foreign object, if you will, that could potentially dismantle the integrity of our bodies. Outside of this pandemic, so to speak, we have very ambivalent relationship with something like shit, like poop, like bodily, crap, if you will. I was teaching this to my students in the high school, and I was telling them, think about your relationship with toilet bowls, right? There's a stereotype that Asian toilet bowls are repulsive to folks that are used to sitting on a raised toilet, where once we expel these bodily waste, we don't have to worry about looking or even smelling them, because they don't even, register in our consciousness. Once we drop them, we flush them, never to be seen from again, Whereas if you have this toilet that's probably common in some Asian contexts, or even in the Philippines when I was growing up, you have to squat and you have this proximity to your waist, and you actually have to contend with it. You have to confront it. So once you deliver the waste, if you will, it's there in front of you. So to what extent do these moments of repulsion tell us something about how we understand the integrity of self? And then the last one is ecstasy, or jouissance. So I love the word ecstasy because it really expresses in so many ways what that experience might seem like. So it's standing outside of the self. When are those moments in which you experience ecstasy? Orgasm. Those sexual moments where suddenly your body has reached the height of pleasure, if you will, that you are no longer functioning, or we're no longer functioning from the realm of reason or logic. It's our body taking over and reacting simply to this profound experience of pleasure. And so, we take orgasm, for example. We take shitting, even vomiting, if you will. We take death. And these are things that sometimes we forget are actually part of what it means to be a self. most often those experiences are at the edge of who we are, because those experiences are things that we know are necessary, but we'd rather set aside because they're frightening for their inability to be controlled. Orgasm, shitting, this dying are things that exceed the limits of our bodily control, exceed the limits of our integrity. And so, in a sense, when Esteva was thinking about the abject, it was really a challenge to think outside the limits of our binary systems. Perhaps there's something to be said about then rehabilitating narratives that escape this phallocentric, this heteronormative framework. So, for example, the wisdom, if you will, of the queer community is the fact that queer identified individuals have always experienced what it means to fall outside the system. Whether because the desires that one experiences doesn't quite fall within the norm, or that the body that one occupies doesn't quite translate within this system. And so the gift of queer subjectivity is that it actually exposes the limitations of this system. So one could argue, following Kristeva, that queer sense of self in a way is an expression of abjection. You know, one is outside the system, but one exists also right at the edge of it. I wanted to highlight this because, you know, in so many ways, in a heteronormative system, we have what we call monogamy, right? Very clear gender roles. For men, you are this. For women, you are this. We forget that monogamy as a concept cannot exist outside of the possibility of polygyny, or even polyandry, or even polyamory. So I'm using words that sort of challenge that, to the extent that monogamy isn't simply this entity that exists on its own. There are specters outside of it against which we react. Oh, I've got to be monogamous. I'm not faithful if I have this sexual desire to another person who's not my partner. Or, you know, there's always this paranoia of monogamy always at the brink of failure. So does that make sense, more or less? I'm just going to sort of leave that there and maybe open it up for discussion. Any thoughts or something? Okay. Should I go on or?
Really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, this actually doesn't have anything to do with the what we're talking about currently. Hey, Albert, do you mind muting your mic when Dr. Campos is speaking?
Oh, sure. Is it too loud?
It's just the birds are really chatty.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's just that the birds, when they're chatting, they'll like cut in, and sometimes they like overpower the speaker. Or Dr. Campos, sorry. So
okay, no worries.
Yeah.
I think you'll have to mute it. Okay.
Yeah, you'll just have to kind of
right.
Yeah, or it is better.
Okay. Or you know what I can do is I can probably just mute. Let me just try. I'm gonna do this, Albert. I'm not shutting you out. I'm not canceling you out. I'm just gonna mute the sound. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. I'm muting myself too.
All right.
Okay.
So, okay. So just unmute yourselves when you can, when you have. So basically, I'm going to go on if you don't have any question. Again, feel free because this is a discussion, right? So ultimately, the gift of this idea of abjection is that even things like monogamy are exposed as tentative systems, meaning they only really make sense because we have this fear of polygyny. We have this fear of polyandry. You know, I was showing this to some of my students that even this Greek marriage functions within a system of a binary. And even once this Greek system shifted into the Christian marriage, there's still a binary. We're sort of stuck with binaries. And so how to think outside of the binary is really somehow, in a way, the constant work, if you will, of a queer consciousness. But I wanted to also highlight that the difficulty with simply saying, let's queer it up, is that even when we challenge the binary, the tendency would be to either not so much challenge the binary, but simply flip the binary into its opposite, in which case we're still existing within a new binary. Does that make sense with everybody so far? So in a sense, rather than propose something that is an alternative to the binary, what I've oftentimes suggested and I've oftentimes thought about is that perhaps resisting a binary or working against it is less about proposing an alternative, but rather a constant vigilance against language, against perspectives or worldviews that leave us stuck within binary systems. Let me just close with this. You know, one of the things that I've always found really fascinating, and this is where I see where our own cultural backgrounds can serve as an antidote. I'm just going to shift a little bit here, is that English and most European languages tend to be binarized, especially when it comes to pronoun usage. You know, so I noticed, like, for example, Anna, what do you call this? After your name, you put in a pronoun to be able to establish a certain gendered identity, right? You know, I grew up in the Philippines where we have pronouns, but we don't necessarily actually have gendered pronouns. So a he and a her is simply siya. So, you know, in so many ways, what does that say about a language that doesn't rely on a gender? And so how does that affect the cultural framework of that language? And how is gender? Because you can't really escape gender. Gender exists to the extent that they're attached to bodies. But in what way is the binary challenged within that cultural framework? So that's perhaps what I would invite us to consider. You know, like we were all in so many ways variations of what we call Asian Americans. What are some of the cultural resources that we have that maybe challenge the limitations of our binary language, our binary understanding of gender and our worldview? So, you know, I'll throw that out there, and then maybe we can just have an open discussion. Any thoughts? And feel free to unmute yourself when you
Dr. Campos,
yeah.
like, I just wanted to clarify,
Yeah.
when we were talking about like developing a kind of queer consciousness,
Right.
and then also, and then after that, you posed this idea of, instead of finding an alternative to the binary,
Right.
which would just flip it over.
Right.
I didn't quite understand that. Like,
so it's almost like, you know how in binaries, there's always an implicit power structure that's at play, right? It's the person who is the dominant, and then the person to whom one is to whom, I'm sorry, the dominant, and then the person who's dependent, if you will, the dominant or the oppressed. I mean, we have different ways of using that. Some of our political work, and I know that many of you, myself included, are involved in political activism, right? One of the things that we always tend to be very mindful of is that to the extent that we're trying to challenge the existing systems of power, that we don't do that to the extent that what we've simply done is put ourselves in a position of power, but then create a new powerless class, if you will. So we're still working within the binary, but we just shifted the people that are playing the role. And so if we're not mindful about that tendency, what's going to inevitably happen is that it actually might aggravate or might magnify those depersonalizations, or those experiences rather of dehumanization that we've been trying to resist.
Right, right.
You know, so that's what I mean by being mindful that a binary, or the concept of a binary, is more powerful than the people that are playing within it. Because regardless of which bodies you put in a position of power, it's the binary itself that really needs to be reconsidered, to be rethought. So I'm really less interested in sort of changing the roles personally rather than rethinking how that binary could be reimagined, rethinking the system itself. And that's what Kristeva was suggesting, that instead of being obsessed about becoming this subject agent who is the captain of my own destiny, maybe we can rethink that expectation and reorient ourselves to that abject, that sense of personhood that in a way is outside of that system, but still is part of that system. Like that shit, that cadaver, that experience of ecstasy, if you will.
Huh. So I guess that kind of brings us to when we're talking about reimagining the binary. That brings us to the point of we were saying about being constantly vigilant about our language, because that's what shapes, I guess, that framework or the meanings that we make and attribute to people and like these labels, I guess.
Right, very much so. Right.
Okay.
Very, very, very much so. And it's challenging, right? Because language and body are not so necessarily distinct from each other. In so many ways, names themselves are already so gendered that, like, for example, my own relationship with the name Michael has always been contentious. Because one, it's a name that was given to me, but it's also a common name in my family. Like literally, so many of my cousins are Michaels and Miguels. It's like for some bizarre reason, every firstborn child who's male has to be some iteration of Michael. So I know that I've been sort of embedded very deeply in this patriarchal, heteronormative system that inevitably, when I realized I was gay, I was gonna fail at. Like that was really clear to me. My mom used to tell me how when I was born, they had a party at the hospital, and then that's when they figured out that my name was going to be Michael, and it wasn't going to be Miguel. It was going to be Michael because my dad wanted to be modern, right? No, not the Spanish name. I'm going to make him Mike. So, and the interesting thing is, I know it's awful, but then, well, I mean, it's not awful, but the only time in which I learned to actually love my name was when ironically, I was in Spain at a synagogue. And, I introduced myself as Mike. And of course, I was trying to speak my non-existent Spanish. And then the rabbi said to me, I know my fake Spanish. And the rabbi actually said to me, "That's a beautiful name because it's a name of a possibility." And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, in Hebrew, it's Michael. It basically is a question, who is like God?" And I said, "Oh my God, it's even more hubris, right? Like you're actually like divinizing yourself. Like, seriously? I mean, whatever, right?" And then they reminded me, I thought this was powerful. You see, the Hebrew God actually, the notion of God in Hebrew is from two sources. You have Yahweh, or the Yod He Vav He, which is based out of Jerusalem, which is very masculine. And the other one is El, which is from the north, which is El Shaddai, which is actually feminine. In fact, the image of El Shaddai is a woman with many breasts. So, and we forgot about that because as Hebrew sort of shifted towards the language of Jerusalem, which is more urban, then it became more masculine and more martial or more paternal. So when they're talking who is like God, they're talking about the feminine God. And then the rabbi said, and it's an impossible name. Isn't that awesome? And then it's so cool. I'm actually named after a feminine God. And then the other thing was that it's a question, which means nobody can ever be like God. And that's the point of that name. It's like, it's an impossibility. You could never be like God. God will always be the other. So I said, "Oh my God, oh my L." So I'm totally going to use that name. It's hilarious. I'm like, oh, I'm going to own that name now, but
yes.
But the ways in which it shifts over time, and that's why binaries exist even in these most implicit ways.
Yeah. I really, really love and appreciate that sentiment of this constant vigilance about the binary. I mean, I guess, you know, it so resonates with my experience, you know, being, you know, genderqueer is what I identify as. And so that is my existence, is constantly being in tension with this binary idea. And so that it was just so wonderful to hear that, because it is like people, you know, people ask me like how, when I do education around how do we be respectful of transgender persons, you know, it really is that people want to make it to normalize it, and in the sense that you can't normalize it because it's so, like we're saying, it's an abject existence, and so there have to be in consistent and continual relationship with it, and then the idea of being vigilant about it, you know, that, you know, you're constantly being forced to reconcile that irreconcilable.
Right. Right.
And I love that. I think for me, like that, yeah, it just resonates, and it feels very affirming to hear that, you know, that, because, you know, so much of who, I mean, when you talk about names, like that, my name is my name. Like I'm that's part of my transition, was choosing my name and leaving that other identity behind, and still it exists within me, you know, and that is still a part of who I am and my story. So even as I've transitioned, I still, you're always tied to that other person who was and who is, because it still exists within me, even though the presentation to the world is not that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Valor. And I think that's important to highlight too, because the way you described it's such that our sense of self is sort of, again, talking about binary, right? There's the outside and the inside. How we are read in a public space is one way of sort of negotiating that self, but then how do we see ourselves inside? So trans identities in so many ways really have taught us so much about how we cannot simply assume this one continuous, unequivocal, if you will, unchallenged, if you will, implicit continuity between the inside and the outside, because sometimes our interior sense of self might be betraying how we present ourselves outside. And so that's why, for example, even as a gay man, it's interesting for me to say this, but as a gay man, I do, and I am aware about the fact that I'm also cisgendered, where how I see myself embodied coordinates with how I see myself inside as male. And I remember having a really powerful conversation. And this will be a good way for us to transition into our cultural resources, right? With another classmate of mine who in the Philippines, we were both simply bakla. I'll introduce that word later on. So bakla loosely translates is this effeminate gay male figure in the Filipino cultural universe. And it's sort of like an umbrella term, specifically masculine, but always like a flamey masculine guy. That's the stereotype. And we both identified as bakla. But then once we moved to the United States, both of us took on a different, how do I say this? Took on different queer paths. I almost seamlessly assimilated into gay men's culture, and I'm using the word gay specifically, where I would date other gay men, and I won't find anything particularly unusual about that. Whereas my friend entered into what is now, at least in the North American ethos, would be like a trans identity path. And basically my friend eventually transitioned. And one of the things that we were naming was, would we have even sort of found ourselves diverging had we not left the Philippines? So in a sense, even queer identities or gender identities and language around gender is also so culturally specific that once we moved here, bakla was not sufficient anymore. That somehow bakla is not the same as gay man. It just isn't. It doesn't quite translate. So I had to be gay. I had to learn to be gay, and my friend had to. Yeah, exactly. It's so weird, right? Like what, Whereas my friend had to learn to be trans. So I mean, this is sort of an interesting story. But my friend had to come out a second time. Even the idea of coming out is bizarre in among bakla, because we are bakla even as children, and you just sort of, you don't ask, are you bakla? You're bakla. Like, I am bakla. I don't have to go to mom and dad and say I am bakla. It's like, okay, iho, you're bakla. Or like in Hawaii, even when we use the word mahu, right? Like, oh, he's mahu, whatever. Like it's just sort of, it's just in the ether, and it's sort of like lived into the whole idea of coming out was for me strange. For my friend, they had to come out twice. Initially as gay because that's what they thought they were, and then eventually when they transitioned, they actually went up to their dad and said, I'm actually trans. And the dad goes, I'm gonna totally Filipinize it. What do you mean you are trans? Does that mean you are bakla? And then my friend was like, no, I'm not quite bakla. Like, but you're already dressing like a woman. What's the difference? Because my friend was already like basically in everyday wear was more feminine. So the dad couldn't figure out, what does that even mean? Like, what do you mean? What's the difference between trans and gay? It was such a fascinating experience. And that's when I realized, oh, that's how deep words are. And so for immigrant communities, immigrant communities really could potentially serve as resources, if you will, to challenging this binary around gender that is implicitly embedded in this Judeo-North American culture that we're almost swimming in, this Christian worldview that we're swimming in.
For me, it was really helpful the more that I listened to and our intersex community and talking to those folks. And that experience, and just, I mean, so much of what you've been talking about is really, I think, highlighted in that community, that rejection of, that as soon as an intersex child is born, that there's really this assessment of, and even that non-consensual, it really is what it is a mutilation of someone's body in order to conform to this binary idea of sex.
Right.
And how we experience that, because we're so uncomfortable with this thing that lies outside, this abjectness that we have to make it conform to our idea and our understanding. Oftentimes, like without the parental acceptance, definitely without the person themselves being able to accept and to consent to that surgery, and how we've really manipulated the idea and our science and understanding in order to conform to that, the ideology as well.
Valor, are you familiar with the documentary Kumuhina?
Yes.
Or A Place
I actually know Kumuhina.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
I'm such a fan. Oh my Lord!
She's wonderful.
You need to give them a hug from me. But did you want to just share with us who Kumuhina is? And because I think she would be a wonderful resource for us, actually.
Yeah. So Kumuhina is where do I start? So she doesn't even identify as transgender, but identifies as Mahu, and really more the understanding of Mahu culture and where that sits within the Native Hawaiian social kind of structure. So Mahu is the person that is that middle kind of ground. So it's what we would, I mean, it's like bakla in that sense that it's not really definable, because it's not, it's most commonly a feminized male, but at the same time it's not. So anyway, but they tend to be, the way they sit within the culture is being kind of the holders of tradition and art and all of, so they really kind of teach that more of that gosh, I'm struggling with my language. Yeah, the holders of culture, in a sense, of the Hawaiian culture. And so Kumuhina is, so Kumu is teacher in the Hawaiian language. So transitioned, and there's a I can actually link a place in the middle is the
Please.
one that they've done for the is actually taught within schools,
right,
to talk about being in the middle and to understand gender and sexuality a little bit more, and how folks there isn't that same binary language. So
no, actually,
I'm not making sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, because what we can do towards the end is, as we're exploring, again, alternatives, and I'm using that word carefully because I don't want to assume that there's another solution. Maybe we can watch a clip of A Place in the Middle, because I actually also use this with my students, right? When we're talking about gender, we often talk about masculine, feminine, and the Mahu actually occupies a very specific gender role somewhere in the middle. And, so I have these, if you can still see the slides, I highlighted this because in this slide, you see words like bakla. In the, I guess, in a certain region of the Philippines, the word bakla is loosely identified as yet a third gender that falls between the lalake, which is the male masculine figure, and the babae, the female feminine figure. And then Laishan Yip, actually, she is a scholar who is Catholic from Hong Kong, actually tried to draw on Confucian tropes, if you will, of gender that challenges even the Confucian hierarchies of paternalism. So what Laishan was challenging was this idea of filial piety that is also very, very gendered. Is also challenged because you have these figures, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, the Tongji, that might actually fall in between these hierarchies that are so solidified within that particular cultural universe. So these are the things that, here's the link. Thank you so much, Valor.
Oh, sure.
So, and then Joseph Go, who is from Malaysia, talks about the Maknya. Again, these are indigenous figures within the Indo-Southeast Asian world of, I'm using words that are so inaccurate because in a way I'm using English. They would be like medicine healer figures, right? That by default, fall outside the norm of provider and nurturer, but somehow hold a community together, which is what Valor was describing about the Mahu. So maybe, rather than, and this is where I love about PAAC, because it's easier for us coming from cultures that have proximity to migration histories, if you will, for the most part, whether first, second, or third generations. We have alternative resources outside of the Judeo-Christian Western European worldview. And so we can rethink the binary in ways that don't seem so easily like, well, let's just destroy the binary. Well, no, that's the danger, right? We destroy it, then we build up another one. And so yet again, there's another binary that's, within seconds are going to be in place. So, and maybe rather than attacking it, but rather, there's other languages. Oh, there are other systems, there are other imaginations that are at play. So, I'm curious, are you familiar with other gender figures or other words within your own cultural contexts that might provide an alternative, if you will, to this?
No, that's something that I'm trying to research more. I think because coming from this Asian American experience, I feel like we have been, at least in my family, has been so assimilated and acculturated that, and then also that we've lost our connection to all of that, and so having to rebuild and to seek that out. So the words that I have now are primarily that of, you know, queer culture and the Western world, and so having to now take that and to find that within my culture is, you know, like I'm mixed Asian, so you know, within Japanese and Chinese culture, what are those things, and I think that because we've really tried to bury that, it's really hard to find. And so I'm glad that there are more examples of that coming up, like Mulan. I mean, Mulan is pretty amazing, but that's not that's the only figure that we talk about, but there are so many other figures.
And you know, even in our let's say, you know, of course I'm thinking about this also of my students who aren't Asian Americans, right? So I think about my predominantly white students. Sometimes what I also try to illuminate are the figures within the Christian tradition that themselves challenge the binary. So for example, so I'm Catholic, so I'm using a lot of Catholic language and tropes here. So for example, the figure of a nun and a monk. The nun and a monk, when we think about it, you know, by the way, so I did live in a monastery for a time, and all of my white students said, "Oh, you're Buddhist." I'm like, no, dear child. I'm just Asian. It was so funny. They were like, "Oh, you're Buddhist." I'm like, no, I'm just bald and I'm Asian. It was actually really funny. Like, oh, no. It was hilarious. So like, no, dear child. But so I lived in a monastery, right? And it was a Catholic monastery in freaking Vermont, which is even more like, oh God, like French Canadian. So it was bizarre, you know? But it was fascinating because, so what does it mean to live in this patriarchal system where the only options for sex would be married life or celibacy, you know, to live amongst these monastic brothers? Now, the interesting thing about that monastery I would share with them is that, one, I was openly gay when I actually joined the monastery. I stayed there for about 2 years. And I was openly gay, and they were fine with it. And of course, when I entered, I realized like half the community were like gay men. So we're like, "Girl, what are you doing? Let's do pottery. Let's do calligraphy over here." You know, it was really kind of funny. But so here were these essentially queer men that were actually living with this erotic energy, but we were very open about the erotic energy. You know, for example, I was really attracted to Brother Michael because, oh my God, Brother Michael was like this woodsman that was, anyway, never mind. I took a moment there, just remembered it. Okay, I'm good. But this hunky, you know, Brother Michael, and we had a conversation, right? Like I actually talked to him. I said, "God, you're hot. What am I supposed to do with that?" But so what does it mean to say, "You're hot, I'm attracted to you," but then say, "But we're committed to live as brothers"? And so be able to say, let's choose to engage in this erotic energy outside of the parameters of a commitment. So not because we think sex is bad, but because we chose to identify the relationship as fraternal. And so what does that mean as a choice? You know, and let's say we do decide, and let's say it was a mutual attraction, and say, well, why don't we explore the sexual aspect of it? So what does that mean in terms of our commitment to this other group of men? So we have the option of leaving. That's always a choice, right? So that for me was like blowing my mind, because in so many ways it was a queer place. But on the other hand, you look at it outside, it looks so patriarchal, because you have these, you know, men chopping wood every day, and then like, it was really funny. But I was doing calligraphy, so there you go, you know. So all of these queer elements that are at play, or even if you were to just watch this film, which is on Netflix, it's called The Two Popes. I mean, I think it's a trip, you know, as a Catholic, because it's talking about the current Pope and the previous Pope. And whoever directed the damn film basically was using ABBA as the background music. So when they were all like processing in, the background music was Dancing Queen. I mean, like, hilarious. It's hilarious. You know, I love that, because let's face it, the papacy is campy. I mean, how any more campy can you possibly get? I mean, you have this group of men walking in dresses with red shoes. I mean, like, let's just name that. So, I think without even like bringing or thinking too quickly outside of the binary, there are elements within the binary that always sort of like, push the specter of
Uh-huh.
heteronormativity. So maybe the other way of approaching it outside of, oh, I'm not white, so I'm going to talk like this exotic queer figure outside of my white world. Well, within the system, there are queer elements. And maybe just naming the campiness of it all is really one way of exposing the system. So that's another method. So the camp elements, they're kind of interesting to see. They really, really are. Especially the red Prada shoes. I mean, really. Oh, sorry. Now you got me started. I have to share this. So I was sharing this with the kids. And I was telling them that the Pope had a triple tiara. Have you all ever heard of that?
Oh.
So, the Pope has 3 crowns. It's like this one big round thing, and there are 3 coronets.
Yeah.
And it represents that the Pope is king. Of course, you have to use this masculine, patriarchal king of heaven, purgatory, and earth. I'm like, that's why the Pope gets to crown every European king. Because they essentially rule over all of these things. And that's why when Napoleon was going to be crowned by the Archbishop of Paris, who was standing in the position of, in the role of the Pope, Napoleon took the crown and said, "Excuse me, I'm crowning myself because this is the age of secularism and I'm pushing back against church figure," right? So he crowns himself, crowns Josephine, who's his consort, as a way to like expose the artifice of this entire system of power. Now that was a campy moment. So who's campier, the Pope or Napoleon? You tell me.
Yes.
Exactly. Anyway, oh my gosh, you got me started. But yes, so that's one way of rethinking the binary. Like, what are the queer elements that sort of like peek their heads in and outside of it?
Professional wrestling.
Totally. Oh my gosh. I mean, seriously. The luchadores. I mean, like, what the heck, right?
Yep. There's actually, it's funny because we're talking, my partner and I were just talking the other day about there's this one group in AEW that they're a tag team and they're called Best Friends. And it came from when they were in Japan wrestling. And so when they're in Japan wrestling, it really emphasized that whole queerness of it. So that's why they were best friends. And so that stuck when they moved over to America. And so it really is this like a play on that kind of a gay relationship that they're these best friends. But they kind of changed it so they don't have that campiness to it, but it's they still call best friends, and it's wrestling, so it's still that. Like, there's so many queer moments in professional wrestling, and all these like really hyper masculine folks get involved in it. It's just so awesome.
I mean, it's
I
like,
love it.
It's like drag show on speed. I mean, it's hilarious.
Oh my God.
It's like, oh my gosh. It's like, what's the difference between this and RuPaul's Drag Race? I mean, it's
nothing.
It's the same thing. It's all drag.
Yeah, I mean, and then now that they're emphasizing the women's division, women's wrestling a lot more now too. There's so much of that for, I don't know, it's just wonderful.
Right. And the religious tropes, I have to say this, which I thought was fascinating. Religious tropes themselves are so gendered, and at the same time, the impulse to queer it is fascinating. So I already talked about the name Michael, right? Like El is actually a feminine image of God. So that's one. But so, for example, we have the Trinitarian model of God. So Father, Son, Spirit. I mean, I have never been in a context where people always just assume that the Spirit has to be a feminine figure. Has to be. Because if you're talking about Father and Son, there has to be some mother figure there somewhere. So the damn bird has been reduced to a spirit, to a woman or something. It's got to be a woman. But, the idea, however, of this this breath, this idea of spirit as breath, ruach, in a lot of ways, it actually transcends the limitations of a gendered body. And it was really helpful for me, at least when I was living in Hawaii, that, the word, what do you call this? Haole, which is interesting because it's sort of the generic term for right now, any white folk. But I think at one point, someone had told me it has something to do with identifying people without breath. And I thought that was really quite beautiful, because the way in which one encounters the other is through this act of breathing in, so you breathe in, and it's not so different, say, from, because it's within the Polynesian worldview where you touch nose, so you breathe in the other person. And so how do you rethink breath and spirit outside a dove or a bird that is now somehow limited to some mother figure, to literally nothing more but the encounter of two bodies? And so you encounter them through breath. So those, we don't have to think outside of the Judeo-Christian worldview to sort of even unveil the ways in which we're already challenging the gender norms within it, actually. It's really challenging that in rather elegant and beautiful ways too. So beyond the red shoes. Okay, I have to stop talking because I can go on and on about this. But any thoughts, or I don't know, anything come up for any of you?
I mean, I could just listen to you talk about all the ways that there are these queer elements within like Judeo-Christian, because I grew up going to like a evangelical Christian school, and everything, and even just like growing up in Confucianism mixed in with like Judeo-Christian like binary systems and stuff. It's so cool to be like, like to grow up in the like this patriarchal system and like always feel like you have to be like super hyper masculine, and
right,
and then also then to like within that system be like, no, like there are these queer elements, there are these things that like you don't need to have like a whole nother system to like create, that you have to yourself create in order to exist within the system, and I think that's like, I would love to just like continue hearing about these, because it's really eye-opening for me in a way, because I'm like just like, oh, you got to be like Jesus, who was like this super masculine carpenter, and like
you gotta be a carpenter, right?
You gotta be a carpenter. You gotta work with your hands,
right.
Live in the dirt.
Yeah,
and that's holy Christianity. And then you will be Jesus. You will be the head of the family. And like all that shit. And I'm like, okay, like. Like I don't because it's kind of come to a point where like I have a hard time being at church because like these things, like I'll be in like these conversations with people who are trying to like police kids and like what they wear and like how they act, and you're like like, but like you just kind of feel like in their like view of the system, like they just feel so like they need to do this for like the safety of everything and the holiness and righteousness of our society,
right.
And so it always ends up kind of feeling like they're reinforcing towards that view of binary. And so yeah, it's cool to like, I don't need to come in and be like feel like a heretic and be like, your system is wrong and like let's tear it down. Like you're causing a lot of pain, and instead being like, look, like there's like within the system I can like it feels like there's like almost a way for us to have that common ground without me being like tear it all down.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something, Anna, or?
Yeah, I really appreciated that last portion we were discussing when you shared about how there are like queer elements even in the Bible and in the language that we see in the Bible. Because one of the questions that I had when we were talking about, you know, being constantly vigilant about our language would be, how do we read the Bible then, and how do we teach the Bible? Because well, at least here in America, or with the English Bible, which is in English, it's like it was written with the Neoplatonistic or Neoplatonic Judeo-Christian worldview and culture. So yeah, I really like that idea too. And what Andy shared was like how you don't have to overthrow like the whole system and like be in conflict with these people. That actually brings me a lot of peace too, because currently my dad's a pastor, and so I'm back at home living with him, and I have to go to his church. It's like my home community, but I've grown very apart from them in terms of like ideology or like political views or worldviews even, or about religion too, while I was in college. And so coming back home has been like a really tough transition, because I felt that tension all the time, like when I was with my friends or at church. But that brings me a lot of peace, and like it's okay to exist in that system, exist in that community, but still challenge it and still find and highlight those pieces of there's still elements in there. There's still I guess conversations to be had and opportunities.
I'm just curious, do you talk to your father about some of these questions, or is that not within the space itself?
A little bit. I try a little bit. He thinks that he's a bit more liberal and would like to think that. But when I'm actually a little bit afraid of bringing up progressive ideas with him. And I think he's overall pretty closed off. So yeah, it's sometimes he feels a lot more like my church's pastor than my father, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, thank you for sharing that. I can imagine. I can only imagine how it is to navigate those different languages, not just perspectives, but literally what's your relationship with the same language, but you have very different interpretations of it.
And then you throw in that like generational mix of like, oh, he speaks like very old Korean, and I'm like, I have my broken Korean, and I'm like trying to like communicate these things. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, no. Thank you. Valor?
Yes.
Did you want to say something, or did you have any thoughts on?
No, I was just thinking about the because I always think of Filipino culture being so nested within Catholicism,
right?
But isn't there more of a indigenous type of, I don't know if it's religion or spirituality that ties in with that too, or how does that?
No, there are indigenous figures. Actually, bakla is not quite indigenous. There is the figure of the babaylan, which is a feminine space that later on, it's very similar to the mahu, where the babaylan is the bearer of the healing and the cultural wealth of the community. But then, while it's a feminine space, if a child shows some inclination towards that child is going to be raised as a girl, as a woman. So the child has to take on feminine comportment in order to be babaylan. So there are male-bodied folks that can be babaylan, but they have to take on a feminine comportment. So yeah, they do exist. And I think there's been a lot of my other research is trying to rehabilitate these queer figures, just to be able to, because the bakla is very much what do you call this, a colonial iteration, if you will. The babaylan precedes the colonial condition. So yeah, and again,
I guess what I was talking about with my group too is that for me, I think because I think part of this fellowship, there's this acceptance of people that were raised within the church.
right.
And for me, that's not the case. And so I very much was raised in this kind of that liminal space of, being Buddhist, being Shinto, being Catholic, going to a Protestant school. And so there's that intermingling of things. So it was very hard to kind of form, I guess, not hard, but it's been more intentional to form my spirituality and my, that experience, because I'm weeding through all of this stuff. So I didn't really have a real sense of myself as a kind of more of a religious type person until like high school. And, there was just some things that you just sort of attached to it,
Right.
But I think I kind of always exist. So much of my life exists in this gray space.
Right.
So I think that's where it's a little bit more challenging for me or there's a lot more intentionality around my experience, I guess, is a more accurate picture.
It's interesting. Before you came on, I was sharing with Albert, Andy, and Anna how when I was living in Hawaii, the first thing that I had to renegotiate was my language and consciousness around race, because it's so constituted in so different ways than it was in the mainland.
Yeah,
It's like accents, the ways in which people are quickly ethnicized, and it's just par for the course. I mean, it's just the consciousness, and we're like, oh my god, I'm gonna get sued, whatever, all of those things, right? And I'm like, should I even say this? Should you even say that? Should I correct? I mean, it was really, and then of course when I came to California, it's like suddenly race conversations sort of like shut down. Like nobody wants to talk about it, right? Which is hilarious. And I'm just like, okay, it was such a powerful experience of, yes, again, context and language really affect our consciousness, where our bodies really find some land.
Because so many people, like, within the Asian American community make this, and it isn't a microaggression when you're living on the continent about, where are you from?
Right.
But in Hawaii, that's the first thing people ask you is, what are you? Like, literally, you're very objectified in that whole sense,
Right.
Yeah. We don't even do where are you from, where's your family from, it's just what are you?
Yeah. It's not even it's just like, what are you?
So yeah, I mean, I don't, I understand it's a microaggression, but for me, it's just so it's you ask that because you want to know, and it ties to people's culture and their everything. So it's a very neutral question here.
Right.
Or what school do you go to?
Which has a lot, right? It just defines everything about you.
Yeah. That's why I hate that question. And Michael, you understand, because I went to Punahou.
Oh, there you go. Oh my God.
Exactly, right? So whenever people go, what school did you go to? And then you say Punahou, then people just go, and it's just this assumption about who you are. Yeah.
Oh,
so challenging.
It's where Obama went to school.
Yeah.
Like it's the most elite school in Hawaii. But yes,
and because it's a missionary school, it's really interpreted as being the white school.
Yes.
So even though there's a lot of Asians there, people just assume that it's the Haole school. Yeah.
Yes, it's not like Iolani where all the Asians are.
Asians go.
Punahou, it's like all the white folks go there. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
so of all the private schools, if you went to St. Louis, then you're probably Portuguese. If you went to Damien,
you're Filipino.
Yeah. And if you Kamehameha is it's a Hawaiian school. You have to be Hawaiian to go there. Iolani is all the Chinese, mostly Japanese. So the schools are all segregated to who people are. Yeah. So Punahou is the white school.
Yeah. So it's not like, what are you? It's really like, what's cool? That's the microaggression.
But most people, they can answer, like, if you went to public school, then it's like where your family lives. And then that means something too, because everything is very localized, So like if you went to Eva Beach, or if you went to Waipahu, there's a lot of Filipino in Waipahu, or, Waianae is mostly the Native Hawaiian, so we're always assessing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh gosh. Fond memories, actually.
See, and it's so hard to explain how different Hawaii is to people that haven't lived here, because it's just its own thing.
Right.
And it's not like being from, like the difference between California and Ohio. I mean, I'm sure there are differences, but it's not the same.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to our conversation around, because there's still a binary that's at play there, right? And again, it's the word that Valor uses. We're reassessing constantly, and that's what binary is. What we're doing is we're reassessing our place within it. Is Albert there? Albert?
No,
I think we lost Albert.
Yeah, I think he might have disconnected.
Oh gosh. Okay.
I'm also gonna use the bathroom really quickly.
Okay. Yes, please. Did you all need to take a break for a second? Use the restroom or anything? Or we're all good? I'm curious. Do you mind if I look at that Butch Jesus?
Yes, please.
That's
It's hilarious.
Actually, can I see this? Oh my Lord, Anna, maybe you can. No, I can't. Like, you can share this at church, maybe not.
Oh my goodness.
No, we're not gonna do that. Let me just actually.
They'll all start laying hands on me.
There's certain generation that will literally just die instantly seeing that.
Let me just get this out. I think, let me just open Butch Jesus. Where did that actually, let me just play with this. Where did it?
I actually Googled Butch Jesus because of what Andy was saying.
Oh my gosh. How come I can't see it? Okay, let's open this. How come I can't open
I love to push the envelope.
Oh,
as
there!
You can tell.
Oh my God! That's Butch Jesus. But you joke. I will show. You all can still see my screen, right? Can you all see my screen?
It's still on your PowerPoint, yes.
It's on my PowerPoint. I will show this other one. Actually, this is Jesus in the National Cathedral. Oh, at least in the cathedral in Washington, D.C. Jesus mural, Cathedral, Washington, D.C. It actually is very Butch Jesus. Just look at this. Sorry, Andy, you inspired us to look for Jesus, the butchiest Jesus we could ever possibly find. So Valor found this for us. That's for you. Can you see it?
Oh yeah, that's my ideal body right there.
Oh my God.
That's the carpenter. There you go. I mean, like, Jesus was probably making, like, I don't know, boats or ships. But anyway, this is an actual mural in the National Cathedral, the National Catholic Cathedral in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
Now, if you were to look at it, and this was a cathedral that was built in the 50s, so it was right at the height of the Cold War. I would show this to my students, and if you notice how, Nordic, I mean, like, could it be any more Nordic? Blonde and angry, very, very, like, this imperial, very, very imperial place. Oh my gosh.
Yes, angry.
Yeah, I could tell. I was just it's like, hi, good morning. They saw Butch Jesus right there.
Yeah.
But
you can growling.
Yeah.
But again, so these are things that are hyper gendered. Oh, and let me show you another one, which is interesting, because in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Washington, D.C., in New York, they have a statue of Christa. Again, it's Christ figure, feminine. So let's just look at that. Christa, St. John the Divine. Let's see this. Oh, Christa. Sorry, I think I made the wrong one. Not quite there. Oops, not quite working. Let me just do this. Christa, St. John the Divine. There. Oh, there. Christa Project. So again, it's trying, there. So it's trying to rethink Jesus, but in this case, Jesus as this feminine, female-bodied figure.
Oh, wow.
Do you see that? Or maybe, I can't seem to enlarge it. But anyway, so you all can see this. Oh, there it is. There it is. Can we all see that?
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, again, I think all I'm simply saying is that this is not actually challenging or throwing the binary upside down, but it's actually playing with the binary. And I think, the question that, Andy had shared initially was like, oh my gosh, how do we wrap our heads around the binary? And I wonder if part of it is really just playing with it in so many ways. And there's so much within the Christian tradition, within the Jewish biblical tradition that we can really draw from to be able to think about it that way. But yeah, oh my gosh, we could go on and on about this. But did you want to see this clip on Kumuhina? Because I think there's something that might be interesting here. Would that be okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do this. It's only about 15 minutes. Are you all okay for just watching? It's about 15 minutes, right? Okay, let's just do this. Oops. For some reason. Okay, let me do this again. Oh, there it is. Oh, because it's opening in my other. Let me share. Let me stop share and then open up the other one. Sorry. We lost Albert, didn't we? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I just messaged him. He hasn't responded though.
Okay, might be an internet thing.
He's okay.
Yeah. Let me see this. Okay. Firefox. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi is a little slow this morning. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is, I think, a place in the middle. Is that what it is, Valor? Oh, you're on mute. Oh yeah, it is a place in the middle. Got it.
They had the full Kumihina film, and then they segmented out the piece just specifically regarding this was about the student, and they had used that to create a anti-bullying curriculum around Native Hawaiian culture.
Right. And so this is Kumuhina, and this is, I forgot their name. Do you remember, Valor, what their name is? Let's see.
No.
Okay, so let's watch this. It's a beautiful, actually, film.
See, when you first look at me, oh yeah, are you a boy? No. And then they give me like a look.
I know that you like to stand with all the boys, and Kumu is okay with that. When you work with other people, they may expect you to stand in the girls' line.
To think about Kumuhina's perspective, people intimidated her of being that way. But I talk the truth all the time. I don't like to lie.
There's a reason you were born in Hawaii or came home to Hawaii. Do you guys get it? You are the warriors of today.
Did you want to share something about that, Fowler?
No, I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of emotions about it.
Right. So this is what actually. Oh, this is what actually they. Oh, this is the one that I was hoping to show actually.
This is the full one.
Right.
It's the half an hour, yeah.
Right. We can just see the beginning. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
So this was the introduction that was really helpful. Yeah. Actually, where is
Sometimes
that?
school says, oh yeah, I have more kana inside than most of the kana. And some kana have more wahine than the wahine. Some people don't accept it. They tease about it. I wouldn't care. Because I myself, other people are their self.
This is the one that I was hoping we could see. This was.
name is Ho'onani Kamai. I was born in Hawaii years ago, but my ancestors have been here for centuries. They came on big voyaging canoes over thousands of miles ago. Despite their isolation, they built up an amazing civilization with its own language and culture and philosophy. Hawaii has changed a lot since then. Many of the old ways have been forgotten, but there are still a few places that are trying to keep the ancient traditions alive. This is one of them, my school. I know it doesn't look like much, but for me, it's a very special place. That's me, and that's our teacher. Cool.
Middle line, step up. Middle line, step up. Can you help me put these lay on the Havana? Yellow to the Kane. Kane, get all the yellow lanes. You have Yan boy lay. See, you get both because she's both. Before the coming of foreigners to our island, we Hawaiians lived in aloha, in harmony with the land and with one another. Every person had their role in society, whether male, female, or mahu, those who embrace both the feminine and masculine traits that are embodied within each and every one of us. Mahu were valued and respected as caretakers, healers, and teachers of ancient traditions. We passed on sacred knowledge from one generation to the next through hula, chant, and other forms of wisdom. When American missionaries arrived in the 1800s, they were shocked and infuriated by these practices and did everything they could to abolish them. Many chiefs and commoners adopted this religious mindset, seeing even hula and chant as immoral. Lawmakers imposed religious strictures across our lands, and all kinds of traditions came to be viewed as ignorant or bad. But we Hawaiians are a steadfast and resilient people. And so, despite 200 years of change and repression, we are still here.
So I wanted to just pause that because one of the things that I found really compelling with that small, if you will, cultural explanation is the role of religion. The ways in which I wasn't really looking at it in a negative sense where the Christians sort of destroyed indigenous cultures. But if we were to step back and look at it as two systems that we're encountering, and so in that dynamic of encounter, there's always going to be power dynamics. And the way colonial encounters happen is that the dominant culture, so to speak, through violence, oftentimes subjugate another people, not just physically, biologically, but literally psychologically. So the entire worldview shifts, and the trauma exceeds really the limits of the body. Like we have traumas in our bodies, right? But it's the trauma of the culture. So now we're burdened with a language that has even defined how our bodies are supposed to be configured. And that's why this film for me was so powerful, because in a lot of ways, it was a good example of how the encounter itself resulted to this enduring trauma that to this day, even though Kumuhina is trying in so many ways to live into this role of Mahu, is not seamless. It's not easy. So even this young student is still trying to negotiate that, right? But yeah, no, this is a really powerful film. I mean, if you have access to the entire Kumuhina, the film itself, it's really rather moving. Any thoughts or impressions? I was thinking earlier when, we talk about religion, while all of us have as a common narrative the Judeo-Christian framework, perhaps one of the things we probably would be, I think one of the things that I've always tried to remind, not just my students, but even my family and even myself, is that Judeo-Christianity itself is an amalgamation of worldviews. That's why I had spent some time defining how the Jewish notion of God, the Hebrew notion, shifted once Neoplatonism came in. So if the roots of the Judeo-Christian worldview is itself hapa, or a hybrid, if you will, a mixture of so many things, then who are we to say that there is a standard that remains static? And if that were the case, then who are we to say that there's only one binary, so that the binary itself is actually unstable? To go back to the question that you all were sort of grappling with, when we opened this session this morning, it's like the binary itself exists because there's a paranoia around anything that threatens it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Because it's one of those, it's like I said, when I do education, we talk about the diversity of gender and sexuality, that it's all on a spectrum.
Right.
And if we look at nature consistently shows us this spectrum and this variety of experience. That the variety in nature is so much there, and then we as humans try to make these distinct categories, even like to say there's male, female, and a middle. That it's not even that specific. It's you don't get the school lunch compartmentalized tray. You just get a plate, and it's all there, and they all mix and intermingle. It's not neat, but
Right.
because of that abject kind of idea that we have to make things separated and distinct, that it makes things so that's the tension.
Right. And that's what I think in so many ways I appreciated with Kristeva. But I appreciate also what Valor said. Kristeva was still proposing a system.
Yeah.
So Kristeva was still proposing language. And to the extent that one does that, we just have to be mindful that there's always going to be a limitation around that language. So, and perhaps, I'm just going to say this because all my friends in philosophy are going to kill me. That's why I like religion. And that's why I sort of identify more as a theologian than I do say a philosopher, because I find that to the extent that religion assumes encounter as the basis of language, encounter with people, encounter with God, you will never stay on that stable standing. To the extent that the other, you call it God, the beloved, the enemy, whatever, is in front of you, you will never fully be able to colonize them, nor will you be fully colonized. So any religious language is really this grappling with the limitations of our ability to fully comprehend. And I think that's the liberative element, if you will, of religious or theological language for me.
I think that's why I've been having so much tension with religion right now, because of those limitations, and because I think because of the need it seems for us to hold those traditions, and the way that the emotion around holding these traditions. And I think I have much more of an anarchist kind sensibility that I'm very much like, let's blow the system up. We don't, like it just,
The Butch
it doesn't need
Jesus.
to be like, like Butch Jesus.
Oh my
And
god.
like it's that, I think, ridiculous to me,
Right.
to reinforce these norms that we have, that there is no normal. And I think it's funny because when so I'm a therapist, a family therapist, and when I was going through my program, our we're talking about abnormal psychology a little bit, and they're saying that on the deviant scale, most people who are therapists rate very highly deviant, because it's being comfortable with this gray space and with this conflict and tension, that in order to be in some ways, they have to be able to step into that grayness with somebody. I've had to sit with people. I've sat with somebody who was a former KKK member, who, and then as a faith person, I've sat with people that were Wiccan, and and you have to be okay with that in order to be able to to effectively work with them. You can't be in this space of, I don't agree with your mentality. You're not helpful at that point. So it's being able to accept that gray space.
Right.
So yeah, I think I definitely would. I definitely am on that threshold of accepting that deviance, and that anything is okay. That really all of the things that aren't are the things that we pose onto something, and the more that you really look at something closely, the more you see that that it's all the same. But we have to be willing to really see it,
right,
and not impose our impressions upon it.
The word deviant, it reminded me of a book that was very popular. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's called The Ethical Slut.
I need to find that now.
I know. You can Google it. I'm sure there's a PDF file somewhere. It's called The Ethical Slut. And the first time I encountered that in the seminary, like we were learning queer theology, and they're like, you have to read The Ethical Slut. And I thought that was brilliant because, again, it's this play on it's a play on the normal, right? Because what does it mean to be normal? I mean, when you're talking about, before same-sex marriage actually was approved, or not even approved, but before that became available in so many ways, who was the slut, who was the immoral? And then of course the big question was, now that it's actually accessible to all, marriage is now accessible to all, then we have to find a new normal, we have to find a new deviant, and I've always found that to be this is really fascinating. And actually, it was a really good discussion regarding.
That makes so much sense.
Like, did we create a new binary now? So now we've expanded.
Now, because now it's cis and trans.
Right. Exactly. Right. Precisely. Who's the new normal? Who's the new? It's all of those things. It reiterates in different ways. So we got our work cut out for us.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
Burn it down.
Just make sure not to build up another one.
Yeah. No, that's so, so that's my struggle with religion right now. It's like, because people are like, like my husband's like, well, there's pansexuality. Why is there not pantheosity, right? So we kind of like, as a group, we've been researching and talking about this thing about pantheism and all of that. But or what was the other one, Andy? It's
Pantheism.
Oh yeah, it's too high for me.
Yeah, it kind of got like, we're like, oh my gosh.
I was like, oh,
uncharted waters. But I mean, it's how, and I think biblically it does go back to that. All things are possible, and not all things are beneficial. And I think it's about deciding what is beneficial for us and not imposing that beneficial on other people. But I mean, I feel like that within our limited context, there's so much that speaks to that. But that's so discomforting for so many of us. I mean, so many of our people in our community that it becomes very challenging.
Right. It's like the theory itself is beautiful, but it really hedges up against lived experience. And I think in so many ways, for me, you know, in as much as I love theological language, the real experience does interesting things for me. It challenges the stability of language, but it pushes me back to the language. And that's why I'm able to find elements like, you know, for those of you that may have, what do you call this, that might have theological background, so you have to study some of these archaic languages, right? But it was really helpful to do that, because then one realizes, the original intent of the word is so different from how we've interpreted it. So even the name of God itself is absolutely like I'm obsessed about this, the ways in which we've negotiated the name of God, because that was the most powerful way in which we impose these structures. You know, whoever gets to name God is the one that gets to name the structure. And
isn't that the whole concept of the fall in the first place, is naming things? And
totally. Oh my gosh, that's brilliant, right? Totally. You name it, you have a structure.
Right? If you name it, you own it, and you dominate it. Oh
Yes.
my God!
See, this cohort can teach the whole class. Oh my gosh. Oh goodness. Anyway.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was so good.
This is awesome. I really appreciate it. We could go on and on, but I have to see my nephew in a few minutes.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for this, because I was sharing before Valor joined us. I was sharing with Andy, Albert, and Anna earlier how my regret with the session was that as just we were just getting to challenging the binary, and then it ended.
Yes.
I'm like, So
that's why we were so like, we're like, no, we need to. There's so much more there.
You're like, oh my God. So I had to email back and say like, oh, here are links, but oh my gosh. So thank you for reaching out. Thank you for just letting me know you just needed space, because it helped me even process how to rethink this model, you know.
Yeah.
How to clear up the model. So there we go.
And it's a Herculean task, I think, to try to condense that into a
2 hours.
2 hours. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
And then throw out readings. Good luck. Have fun with the readings. I'm like, what the heck is that all
about? Next time, just come in and be like, we're burning it all down.
Yes.
Everything's down.
From the beginning.
No, this is actually really cool, because I think that was the reason why I said, okay, if you all just want to talk, let's just check in, right? Because so last year or 2 years ago, the Seattle group basically said, okay, we need to talk. So they ended up like flying me up to Seattle and then just like,
wow,
no way.
Well, because you know, it was really kind of interesting, because one of them had like buddy passes anyway, and then the other one had like an Airbnb. It would really work out, right? So that was like, okay, that's totally fine. So literally, I flew there for a night and then came back just to do it. But
that's brilliant.
It's just so needed. Like we need these spaces. So whether we do it through Skype, through Zoom, or whatever, I mean, the fact that you folks have a cohort, I think, is really, really what is at the heart of this. Just having that conversation. So.
Are you coming to the conference?
Not this year, unfortunately, because it actually challenged my not challenged. Oh my God, my language is falling apart. It actually conflicted with the school event. And of course, things went downhill with that. I mean, I shouldn't be lamenting this too quickly, but with the pandemic, you know, everything just.
I know. We don't even know if we're having that right now.
Oh, really? Is there?
Well, no. I mean, it's still there. It's all everything's all in place.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, who knows? Like, we don't even know what's going to happen next week. You know.
I know, because right now we're in this place where we're canceling. Anyway, so we're all in the same boat. So.
Yeah.
But thank you again, and unfortunately I do have to go see my nephew.
Okay.
Yes,
I gotta play baseball, you know. I gotta do the I can't even
go,
throw
but
a ball.
You just
exactly, there you go. Thank you all so much. Please
Thank you.
Send my regards
thank
to
you.
Albert, and I'm sorry to have missed him, but I will.
Oh, no,
start
he's
the
back.
recording.
Oh,
He's back. Hi, Albert.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Albert. By the way,
Going
before
in
I
and out. I
go,
apologize.
but before I go, did you? We were just checking in earlier about some thoughts, but I wanted to just check in and just ask if you maybe have some thoughts that were sort of lingering or emerging for you.
No, I appreciate just being able to listen, and I feel a lot better in the sense that I don't. I think before I think that I kind of had a left column and a right column, and things belonged in a certain column, but now things are a lot more fluid for me, which is good, I think, and they don't belong in that column, much like Andy before. That Jesus had to be a carpenter, and so did we, but it's not like we have to be fishermen, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
that it's okay to not only just have different professions, but just different parts of who we are, and it's nice to not have to have that attached to us.
Right. And with those wise words, we will close. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody. And
Yeah.
I will
Bye.
record this and I'll upload it and I'll share the link with all of you.
Oh, thank you.
Perfect.
So when
Sounds
we have
good.
nothing better to do, we'll just talk about camping Christianity.
Yes.
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 Let's continue.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you all, everybody. Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.